When I came out on stage here tonight, I said, this Dallas audience wants to listen to the quiet songs. Am I right? I hope so.
In both his solo career and fronting Genesis, Phil Collins dominated the 1980s. His many ballads crowded the radio, his rounded face loomed from record store shelves. And everywhere, the Academy Awards, Band Aid, Live Aid, Miami Vice, Phil Collins was there. However, it was a monkey's paw kind of deal. He became omnipresent, but at the same time became the punchline to every joke. He sold as many records as U2 or Bruce Springsteen, but the initial jolt towards a solo career was when his whole world fell apart. It was the breakup that spawned that seminal drum fill, the sound of the 80s, and the odd, persistent urban legend. This is New British Canon, and this is the story of In the Air Tonight. In 1975, Phil Collins got married to his on-again, off-again childhood sweetheart, Canadian-born Andrea Bertorelli, having first met and dated in drama school in London as teenagers. Her family returned to Vancouver, which ended the relationship. But when the band he drummed for, Genesis, toured Canada for the first time in early 1974 to promote Selling England by the Pound, Collins and Bertorelli reconnected, getting married the following January in the 2-week gap between legs of the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway tour. A spectre of things to come, there was no time for a honeymoon. 1975 was a pivotal year for Genesis. The 7 years prior, the band had become one of Britain's biggest concert draws, with their elongated art rock, audiences allured by their musicality, intelligence, and their charismatic frontman Peter Gabriel's costumed storytelling. In the eyes of the press, they were a bunch of toffs, public schoolboys who hardly conformed to the rock and roll standard. Their fans long overcoated, fishing-hatted student types who either made notes or spaced out to their labyrinthine epics, like the 23-minute-long Supper's Ready.
We walked across the fields to see the children of the West. Open your eyes, it's full of surprise. Everyone rides like a fox on the rocks.
But despite this association, in April 1974, they managed to earn themselves their first UK Top 40 single, with the Beatlesque whimsy of I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe, a rarity for such an album-focused genre. Furthermore, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway from November 74, an ungainly double LP with lyrics and concept penned almost entirely by Gabriel, would continue their international ascent, their first album to crack the US Billboard Top 50. But Gabriel tired of the rock and roll lifestyle. He hated the constant cycle of writing, then touring, with no room for other projects. Complicating matters, he and his wife were dealing with the difficult birth of their daughter. The stress negatively impacted his ability to write lyrics, resulting in long instrumental interludes on the Lamb Lies second LP. When he told the band of his intention to leave during a stop in Cleveland, no one was surprised. He stayed until the tour wrapped up in June 1975 and left Genesis without a frontman, after several months of auditions for a replacement, training them on new tracks on the in-progress A Trick of the Tail album. They had found nothing but disappointment. But as he had been coaching the applicants through the new songs, and on the suggestion of his wife, Collins hesitantly stepped up. It is a complete lie to suggest that I was happy to jump in after Peter left. Sure, the perception that Genesis was a one-man show did frustrate me, but the last thing I wanted to do was become the singer. Being the singer was the least respectable gig in the band, as far as I was concerned. But in the end, the guys said that I sounded better than the people I was teaching. Their audience were not unfamiliar with Collins' voice. He had provided harmonies on Genesis records since he joined in 1970, and even sang lead a couple of times.
Looking back at days of 4 instead of 2. And then the lady would say that she had enough.
It also helped that Collins' soft tone was reminiscent of Gabriel's. However, Collins would face an uphill battle in filling the place of their beloved former singer. His main worry wasn't taking Gabriel's place as a vocalist, so much as taking his place as a storyteller. Gabriel told bizarre stories to keep the audience entertained, while guitarist Mike Rutherford tuned his 12-string, and the surreal anecdotes had become an important part of the band's image. Plus, with former King Crimson sixman Bill Burford, and later Frank Zappa veteran Chester Thompson filling in on drums, he felt a bit exposed on stage when no longer hidden behind his drum kit. Their first album with Collins fronting, February 1976's A Trick of the Tail, hit number 3 on the charts, equaling Selling England, and remaining on the UK album chart for 7 months. Collins was on tour to promote the album while his pregnant wife stayed at home. He returned home long enough to witness the birth of their son, Simon, in September, but had to leave a few days later to record A Trick of the Tail's follow-up, Wind and Withering, in the Netherlands. His constant absence was already beginning to impact his new marriage, but the Genesis industrial complex must always be moving forward, stopping for no one. In hindsight, I could have said, F Genesis, I'm off to look after my wife. But we're all expected to give everything to the band, even if there are later recurring attempts to reverse engineer such situations. Well, if only you told us, we could have moved the start date. But while I've been emboldened as a performer by becoming the frontman, behind closed doors I'm too timid to speak up. Collins' marriage wasn't the only relationship dissolving. Guitarist Steve Hackett was frustrated with his bandmates' lack of interest in his songwriting efforts, so left during the mixing sessions for their 1977 live album, Seconds Out. Rather than replace him, the remaining band members decided to continue as a three-piece, at least on record. Phil Collins on drums and vocals, Tony Banks on keyboards, and Mike Rutherford on guitars and bass. The resulting album, March 1978's And Then There Were Three, saw them move further away from the extended prog rock of previous releases, instead edging closer to the Beatles and Kinks-style singles group they'd always aspired to be. Their atypical love song, Follow You, Follow Me, was even a UK top 10 single. Gaining Genesis a bunch of new fans, but alienating older ones. Because I had become the singer a couple albums earlier, I was given the blame. Suddenly there was this guy that not only can sing and play drums, but he's been to drama school. Fans thought he's probably Mr. Showbiz, and he's pushed Pete out. And it wasn't like that at all, but it makes a better story. The truth is, we grew up, we matured. In 1978, Genesis went all in to try and break the US. In the UK, they'd had hits, their albums were selling well, but the UK is a much smaller market. At the time, a British band needed to commit to touring consistently in the hopes that their songs might get picked up by local radio stations in the US. So for their resulting 8-month 1978 world tour, Genesis played 48 dates over 3 non-consecutive months in the US and Canada, after which Follow You, Follow Me had reached number 23 on the US Billboard chart, and Then There Were Three had gone gold in both the US and Canada, and Phil Collins' marriage had fallen apart. 40 years of he said, she said have blurred the details of what exactly happened. Before leaving on tour, Bertorelli has said she had expressed to her husband that she felt like she wasn't going to be able to cope with him being away for so long, in their Surrey home with 2 young children, and her friends and family in Vancouver. Collins remembers it more as a threat. If you go, I won't be here when you get back. Famously, Collins points to Bertorelli's affair with the guy he'd employed to paint the house as their marriage's endpoint. Bertorelli contends that in her mind the marriage was over way before that his neglect, temper, and his own alleged infidelities had driven her away. And indeed, one cannot fathom just how much your wife has grown to resent you when you are on different continents for months at a time. When the tour ended, Bertorelli took the kids back to Vancouver for Christmas. Collins followed his wife in an attempt to save his marriage, intent on living in Canada if that was what it would take to win her back. As such, he told his bandmates that functionally he was out of Genesis, being that the 10-hour commute to band practice would not be tenable. But fearing they might lose another frontman, Banks Rutherford and band manager Tony Smith instead allowed him some compassionate leave to sort his life out. I was on the edge and wondering about leaving Phil, so I hoped space would help me decide. Unfortunately, time is the one thing he wouldn't give me. He'd call constantly, and when I'd answer, instantly start raging, calling me names, telling me to come home. He turned up unexpectedly a couple of times. He didn't realize he was driving me further away. The last time we were together, he booked us into a lovely hotel in Vancouver and tried to persuade me to come home, but it was too late. In the end, Collins spent 4 months in Canada before realizing his efforts were for naught. It was over. As he returned to England, he couldn't just go back to work to numb the hurt. Genesis had taken a year off for the first time ever. Banks and Rutherford were in Sweden, taking this hiatus to work on solo records at ABBA's Polar Studios. Instead, he was left to either stare at the walls of his newly refurbished, empty Surrey home, or spend his time at the local pub. Therefore, as a way of channeling his emotions, he started writing songs about his situation. He demoed these by converting his house's master bedroom into a home studio with an 8-track tape machine, Prophet 5 synthesizer, piano, and Roland CR78 drum machine. Songs like The Roof is Leaking, I Missed Again, and the more pointed If Leaving Me Is Easy, would be moulded by his downbeat, meditative mood. While composing these songs, most of the time Collins would find a vocal melody first, and then notes would become words, become sentences, their intent and meaning mostly subconscious, but almost always about his wife.
And your words start to fade.
Collins didn't just make his own music during this time. During the recording of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Brian Eno had contributed his trademark electronic treatments to a couple of tracks.
The hall runs like clockwork. The hands mark out the time.
And returning the favour, Collins had drummed on the Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy track, Mother Whale Eyeless. Since then, he continued to drum for Eno. As well as becoming a frequent collaborator within the British art rock inner circle. So in 1979, he supplied beats for Robert Fripp, former bandmate Peter Gabriel, and folk jazz rocker John Martin. In the latter, he found a co-conspirator in romantic anguish. Martin too was going through a particularly bitter divorce. As such, much of his emotionally raw 1980 album, Grace and Danger, was recorded in Collins's bedroom, in between the two men making angry, drunken phone calls to their exes. With John, it was it was far more intense, because we were both involved in the breakup of our particular marriages, with the consequent frictions ultimately providing both our albums with the main lyrical thrust. First, I noticed that John was in something of a bad shape, and I offered moral support by inviting him to stay here in the house, where we recorded the basic tracks for Grace. Actually, we ended up offering each other incredible moral support. When I was being shaken up, he'd help me out of my particular slump, and vice versa. When Genesis reconvened in the second half of 1979, Collins for the first time had a bevy of songs to submit, playing the threadbare home demos to his bandmates. A couple were snatched up for their next album, 1980's Duke. Misunderstanding would end up its third single, and number one in Canada, and was Collins' attempt to ape various soft rock radio songs, most strikingly Toto's Hold the Line. On Please Don't Ask, he was more stark in his feelings. A reflection on all he had lost over the last year. After completing the album, Collins was given the job to drive down to London and play Duke to the head of their US label, Atlantic, the legendary record producer, Ahmet Ertegun. After listening to the album with some drinks, he asked Collins how he was, how the looming divorce was going, what he'd been doing to stay sane. Collins could answer all these questions with the demo cassette he kept in his car tape deck, so played him these rudimentary, heartbroken songs. Ertegun was particularly impressed by an ominous, slow burner, built on simple synth chords, and an ambling drum machine beat, a track that his bandmates had dismissed. However, when the man who discovered Aretha Franklin and Otis Redding thinks you have a hit on your hands, you take notice. What is instantly striking about In the Air Tonight is its drum machine beat, a ceaseless, hollow mechanized shuffle. After their visit to Japan at the end of 1978, the members of Genesis were each gifted a CR-78 drum machine from electronics company Roland. Collins initially dismissed the offer. As a drummer, why would he ever need one? It was only after he started writing that he understood its utility as both a metronome, and so he wouldn't have to go to the effort of miking up live drums in his bedroom. But the robot filling in is essential to the pitch black mood of In the Air Tonight.
The whole thing was set up by this, really, the mood of this drum machine, for me. When you hear that, you couldn't possibly replace that with real drums. You know, people say, why do you use drum machine, you know, when you're a drummer? And it's just that sometimes drum machines give you things that, it's the atmosphere, it's relentless, it doesn't move. A drummer would get bored playing anything like this, so you put the don't, and it would ruin the sort of, the relentlessness of it.
The song is an exercise in dynamics. Much of Genesis's early work had various ambitious elements fighting to be heard. In the Air Tonight is the opposite. It's mostly negative space. This is, of course, why when the real flesh and blood drums thunder in, it's so impactful. They burst through the silence.
Can you feel it calling in the air tonight?
Collins' original demo doesn't have the drum break, nor the increase in intensity after the line,
Not a stranger to you or me.
It wasn't until we started recording the songs with Hugh Padgham for Face Value in late 1980 that the real drums were added, and that especially battering tone was seized upon. Collins had previously worked with Padgham when he drummed on Peter Gabriel's third self-titled album, known as Melt, where on the track Intruder, Gabriel tasked Collins to create a drum beat without cymbals. At the same time, Townhouse Studio 2, where they were recording, had a brand new SSL desk with cutting-edge filtering and compression technology. When Collins was tuning up, Padgham had pressed the reverse talkback button, and Phil's practice hits took on an impressive weight, creating what would become his trademark drum sound. The whole essence of the sound is the compression of it, which makes it sound really fat, and then the second that there is a lull in the sound, the gate just shuts it off. The fact that the drums were in a very live room. When you compress a sound in a live room, it brings up all the background noise and the echo in the room. When you compress a drum sound in a live room like that, it makes it just sound much bigger, and it makes the room sound bigger as well. Therefore, when you go from something sounding big to nothing, you get this feeling of massive contrast. That is the whole essence of why the sound was so interesting, because it is going from all to nothing in milliseconds. This gated reverb process was repeated for In the Air Tonight. Furthermore, the ba-dum 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 dum dum was a late addition, and a suggestion from Ertegun. His belief was that without that seismic fill, no one would know how to dance to the last part of the song. Without the lead in, no one would know where the first beat of the bar is. It also acts as a release of tension, both in the song, but also metaphorically. After going to Vancouver and trying to reason with her over the phone, his songs were his last attempt to communicate his hurt to his soon-to-be ex-wife, though passed through his usual subconscious spontaneity.
I can feel it coming in the air tonight.
Though In the Air Tonight might seem to have a storyline, the drowning, the remembrances, the lies.
Well, if you told me you were drowning, I've seen your face before, my friend. It's all been a pack of lies.
Is just his frustration and resentment at not being heard, filtered into a piece in D minor, the saddest of all keys.
Well, I've been waiting for this moment for all my life.
As soon as he got his words together, he wrote them down on the nearest piece of paper he had at hand. It just so happened it was an invoice from the decorators.
So you couldn't wipe off that grin. I know where you've been.
I went through a lot of pain. I don't mean Lennon pain, but I did go through an awful lot of bad times when my marriage broke up. Because I went to school with my wife, and I went out with her on and off since I was 13. And every man wants an heir, and I had a fantastic son, and I have a daughter as well, and I couldn't believe it. I spent hours on the phone when she left me. Contrary to conventional wisdom, In the Air Tonight, this weird, slow, synth-led murder fantasy, was released as Face Value's lead single in January 1981. Expectations were low, with the song entering the UK chart at number 36. But after Genesis had snubbed Top of the Pops during the 70s, Phil Collins would appear on the nation's favourite music show and elevate the song significantly.
I can feel it coming in the air tonight.
Wearing the same kind of white Converse that he was married in, and with a conspicuous can of paint on his makeshift keyboard stand, he seemed to be sending psychic knives directly to his now ex-wife. Not that Collins saw it that way.
Know where you've been. It's all been a pack of lies.
The Top of the Pops performance has become one of those myths. I wasn't a singer yet, or didn't feel like one, and I didn't want to just stand there, so we decided I'd sit and play keyboards. But what are we going to put the keyboards on? A keyboard stand looks poncy, so we decided on a workmate. Then there was the drum machine. Where are we going to put that? Put it on a tea chest. Tea chest, workmate. During rehearsal, more and more things got added, and one was a paint pot. The ex-wife saw it and thought it was because she went out with a decorator. She saw it and felt guilty, but honestly it was the farthest thing from my mind. In the Air Tonight eventually managed to get to number 2 in the UK, denied the top spot by John Lennon's Woman, the nation still in mourning. Face Value was released in February 1981, while Collins had stuck with Atlantic for the US release of his solo work. He signed to Virgin Records in the UK rather than Genesis home, Charisma. This was to escape the associations with progressive rock of his band's label, onto something quite the opposite. The label that had sired the Sex Pistols, Nevermind the Bollocks, onto an unsuspecting world. The fact that Face Value went platinum within its first 3 months also arguably helped save the label, who was struggling after some poor investments in the late 70s. Phil Collins ended up selling a lot of records in the 1980s. As much as the album's other singles, I Missed Again and If Leaving Me Is Easy, didn't do as well as In the Air Tonight, merely top 20 hits.
Did I miss again? I think I missed again. But I hide my feelings, so no one knows.
Over the decade, Face Value spent 270 weeks in the UK charts, i.e. half of the 80s. Considering how instantly successful Collins' solo career was, his bandmates in Genesis were fearful that they might again have to find another frontman. Our most difficult moment could have been when Face Value was such a massive success. We were all writing Abacab at the time. Face Value goes in at 29, and Mike and I think, pretty good. The next week it's number 2 and you think, oh shit. No matter how strong your friendship, there is rivalry too. You feel he's transcended the band, and you wonder what effect it's going to have. But I think we could take it because we were 30ish by then. Anyway, we carried on joking about how short he is, and that diffused it completely. In between Abacab and a self-titled album from Genesis, Phil Collins released Hello, I Must Be Going. If Face Value was the breakup album, Hello was the divorce album. Opener, I Don't Care Anymore, distilling the sentiment of the drawn-out, lawyer-filled process of dividing marital assets into 5 minutes of pounding rage. But despite moving on with another relationship, getting married again in 1984, this would not be the last time Phil Collins released a song inspired by Andrea Bertorelli. Against All Odds came about as he sketched out the songs from Face Value, originally titled How Can You Just Sit There? But he felt it was a B-side at best, compared to the other high-quality ballads on his debut. Then in 1983, Taylor Hackford, director of An Officer and a Gentleman, came knocking, asking for a new Phil Collins ballad for his modern remake of 40s noir, Out of the Past. As Collins was, as usual, on tour, he buffed up this old demo, with the chorus now featuring the film's title. It was written at the height of my troubles with Andy.
Just let you walk away, just let you leave without a trace.
And forced at gunpoint to analyse it. I'd have to say it's a good breakup song, with universal resonance and empathy.
'Cause we've shared the laughter around and didn't share the tears.
People hate a breakup, but they love a breakup song. Against All Odds pins down how it feels to be brokenhearted.
There's nothing left here to remind me, just the memory of your face.
And it's a big vocal, impactful, raw, real. I don't remember having the pain and misery coursing through me as I stood in the vocal booth, but I must have drawn it from somewhere. That's what the song needed, so I went for it.
Take a good look at me now, 'cause I'll still be standing here.
Despite originally being written in 1979, Against All Odds was nominated for Best Original Song at the 1985 Oscars, losing out to Stevie Wonder's I Just Called to Say I Love You from The Woman in Red.
Just call to say I love you.
Additionally, the unknowable, unstoppably attractive woman portrayed in the Genesis 1986 US #1 hit, Invisible Touch, is also, according to Collins, in part about Bertorelli.
But she crawls under your skin, you never quite say.
Though by the time it was a hit, he had been remarried for 2 years.
Falling for her, she seems to have
Alongside his Genesis and solo career, Collins still had time to collaborate, both as a drummer and producer. In the early 80s, he worked with Robert Plant, Eric Clapton, Adam Ant, again with John Martin. As well as ABBA's Frida on her own 1982 Divorce album, Something's Going On.
I know there's something going on.
Her not only utilising his drum sound, but also covering his You Know What I Mean.
Just leave me alone with my dreams.
I can do without you. You know what I mean.
On his first two albums, to give the ballads an authentic soul sound, Collins had employed the services of the Phoenix Horns, the brass section of Earth, Wind and Fire.
I think I missed again. Now I'm living on borrowed time, but it's mine.
And so, when co-lead singer of EWF, Philip Bailey, needed a producer for his 1984 album Chinese Wall, Collins was his man. Their gated reverb, snare-rocketed soul rock duet Easy Lover was an additional Collins mega hit.
Easy lover, she'll get a hold on you, believe it.
And when Boomtown Rats, Bob Geldof, and Ultravox's Midge wanted a famous drummer to play on their 1984 Christmas-themed charity single, Collins was the only name that came to mind. By this point, Phil Collins was inescapable. Not including Genesis, he sold 120 million albums worldwide during the decade. His 1985 album, No Jacket Required, going 12 times platinum in the US. Sure, there were his many, many airways monopolizing singles.
No, you just have to wait. She said, love don't come easy. I can't go on, just holding on. One more night, oh, just one more night. Just say the word, living in just one mind. We've had our problems, but I'm on your side. You're all I need. You and me in paradise.
But he also found ways to appear on film and TV.
Pick it up and put it in your pocket, or somebody else will.
He was also the only musician to play both the London and Philadelphia halves of Live Aid, travelling by Concorde so neither time zone went without hearing him sing In the Air Tonight. And that was as well as playing with Sting, Eric Clapton, and the disastrous Led Zeppelin reunion. Of course Jesus knew him. He'd have to be living under a rock not to.
Oh, yes, he knows me, and he knows I'm right.
I can look back now and see how annoying I must have been to people in the 80s and 90s. It must have felt like I was in their faces all of the time. It would be Genesis album, Genesis tour, Phil Collins album, Phil Collins tour. Phil Collins produces somebody else. People said my marriage broke up because I was so busy in the 80s. But I don't think I was a workaholic. I was just asked to do the most incredible things. Things you couldn't possibly refuse. Phil Collins was never cool. Unlike other multi-million selling pop stars in the 1980s, he never really courted the teenage market. He was a divorced dad in his 30s. And simply, he was not Prince, nor Madonna. Critics were less than kind, attacking his music, him constantly talking about his divorce, and the way he looked. Despite having been in the music business for over a decade by this point, he bruised easily, took these comments personally, and regularly wrote into publications to defend himself after bad reviews, or being used as an unfair punchline. Journalist Julie Burchill once described him as the ugliest man since George Orwell. I had to go out and find a picture of him. He wasn't particularly ugly, actually. On the next single, there was a line saying,
Don't take my pictures off of the wall.
and this time she wrote, I wouldn't put his picture on the wall. It would scare the cat. It's a laugh now, but at the time I was so pissed off that it had nothing to do with the music. I'm learning to turn my back on that kind of thing. But even so, if it's there, I still have to read it. A particular angle that many critics went in on was comparisons to Peter Gabriel's parallel solo career. Collins had written a bunch of credible yet soppy blue-eyed soul ballads, while cool, artful Gabriel had collaborated with Kate Bush, was pushing prog pop to strange new places, and created a high-selling masterwork in 1986's So. The imagined rivalry was further stoked in the summer of '86, when Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer dethroned Invisible Touch from the top of the Billboard Hot 100. Plus, it can't help but sting that a delusional yuppie psychopath prefers your work with Genesis.
I've been a big Genesis fan ever since the release of their 1980 album, Duke. Before that, I really didn't understand any of their work. It's too artsy.
And as much as he was the bane of retail workers during the Thatcher era, the British backlash against Collins didn't truly hit until the 90s, partly due to a couple of sketchy tabloid stories that have been morphed by public opinion into fact, that he's a tax-evading Tory, and that he ended his second marriage via fax. The former made NHS workers stop buying his records in disgust, and the latter undercut his appeal as a sensitive balladeer. According to Collins, both were misunderstandings taken out of context, with few wanting to listen to both sides of the story. Another rumour repeated as fact during the 90s was the truth behind In the Air Tonight. Supposedly, Collins witnessed a man drowning his wife, but didn't call the police. Instead, he sent this man front row tickets to his concert, and as he began singing In the Air Tonight, for the first time ever, he put a spotlight on the man, exposing his crime. And this confusing, clearly false story, or a variation of which, was told and retold so often on early internet music discussion boards that Eminem referenced it in Stan.
About that guy who could have saved that other guy from drowning, but didn't. Then Phil saw it all, then at his show he found him.
But part of the reassessment of Phil Collins and his work is down to how beloved he is by US R&B and hip-hop acts. Because of his signature drum sound and emotive voice, Collins is regularly sampled.
So I'm seeing nothing but my dreams coming true while I'm staring at the world through my rear view. I can feel it coming in the air tonight.
Ballin' like a hot boy. Diamond dancing on me more than JB Block, boy. I'm a boss, I don't wanna call the shots, boy.
In 2001, a tribute album, Urban Renewal, gathered together Brandy, Old Dirty Bastard, Montel Jordan, Lil' Kim, Khalees, and Pharrell to cover some of his greatest hits, in what Q Magazine would rank as the third worst album of all time.
You and me,
It's against the odds. That's a chance I've gotta take.
Back when it used to be the 80s, said the world was going in 2000. That's crazy.
we got better things to do with our time. We don't care anymore. We don't care anymore.
Still, Collins was surprised but heartened by this appreciation. Let's face it, we all think black R&B artists know what they're talking about. The first time I was aware of it was when I watched a documentary on Ice-T. This smug UK journalist looking at his record collection said, "What's with all the Phil Collins stuff?" He said, "Don't mess with my Phil." I remember thinking, my God, you feel like ringing people up and saying, "Are you watching this?" In the Air Tonight's gated reverb drum sound would be, for better or worse, the sound of the 80s. but it's also the sound of every artist from the last decade or so that's been nostalgic for 80s production.
Gonna be okay anyway.
Always keep your heart locked tight. Sound in my heart, the beat goes on and on and on and on. Oh baby, take me to the feeling.
Plus, the covers of Phil Collins' work are legion. In 2004 alone, we got both the Indie-tronica of the Postal Services Against All Odds,
Take a look at me now. There's just an
and the new metal digression of Non-Points In the Air Tonight.
I can feel it coming in the air tonight.
Over the last 25 years, Phil Collins has retired several times, his body battered and him left partially deaf from a lifetime of doing what he loves, hitting drums really hard. But before then, he won an Oscar for You'll Be in My Heart from Disney's Tarzan. Pissed off the creators of South Park, and soundtracked the best chocolate advert ever. He is a contradiction, a former art rock darling who worked with Eno, Fripp and Gabriel, and released a seriously avant-garde debut single. Yet he sold millions of records, became a figure of ridicule, and that same oddball single is universally beloved, an evergreen track to air drum to in your car. Noel Gallagher once said, "Just because you sell lots of records, it doesn't mean to say you're any good. Look at Phil Collins." But while Oasis 2 have sold a lot of records, I think it's In the Air Tonight that will live forever. Thanks for watching. So what are your feelings on Phil Collins? Love him or hate him? Comment down below. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and why don't you also share it with a couple of people? It really does help. As always, I'd like to shout out this month's new top tier supporters over on Patreon: Jordan Parsons, Powell Swazinski, Joseph LeBleu, and Tom Lieb. And thanks to everyone else that supports me. And I'll see you in a few weeks' time for a look at some clomping, some slapping, and some yaring.